Hey everyone, Sarah here, back with another video. So in the last video in this series, we spoke about basically the story structure that is the building blocks for most other story structures, and that was the 3-act structure. But in today's video, as you can tell from the title, we're going to be talking about another very popular story structure, and that is the hero's journey. So again, this is a structure that is very similar to the 3-act structure, but is designed very specifically for certain types of stories. So today, I'm not actually just going to be showing myself talking the entire time. We're going to have a little diagram in a moment that I'll bring up on the screen so we can start discussing all the different, basically the acts or the beats of the hero's journey. And then, like in the last video, I will also talk about what sort of stories are suited for this structure. And hopefully that will help some of you guys. Okay, so let's get to it. Okay, so here it is. So this is just a drawing program, but this is a diagram from Reedsy that I'm sure a lot of you have seen, especially if you've, even just, Googled the hero's journey. This is one of the images that pops up. And I like this one because it clearly breaks down the different acts. Yeah, so it's pretty easy to understand. But anyway, let's have a quick overview of what each act is. And then we will go into, like we did with the last video, each beat. Okay, so first up we have Act 1 down here, which is this blue section. So this is basically the equivalent to Act 1 in the 3-act structure, where you have your setup, your inciting incident, the thing that sets the ball rolling and whatnot, and the sort of introduction into the new world. Next, we have, again, Act 2, which is this green part, which, just like in the 3-act structure, should take up the bulk of the story. This is where all of the interesting things happen, all of the trials and tribulations, all of the conflicts. This is where the character is actively heading towards a goal or something that they want, something they need, or to find the answer to a question, but they are being hampered in some way. And then we have Act 3, which is this yellow bit. And this is obviously the equivalent to the last act, Act 3, of the 3-act structure, which is where you have your climax to the story and your resolution. So as you can see, the basis for the hero's journey is basically the same as the general 3-act structure. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on that, because if you check out my video or any other video on the 3-act structure, you'll understand what this means, this idea of beginning, middle, end. The Act 1 setup, the middle, long sort of adventure time, fun time where everything happens, and then the conclusion of the story. Okay, so as far as its bare bones go, the hero's journey is basically the same as the 3-act structure. However, so when you see diagrams of the 3-act structure, quite often they'll look like, for example, a pyramid or a triangle, your beginning, your middle, your end, or they'll look like this sort of step like this, where you have your Act 1 build up, your Act 2 sort of conflict, main part of the story leading into a climax, and your Act 3 sort of resolution. But when you look at diagrams of the hero's journey, they're almost always a circle. And that's because the hero's journey has a very specific formula for starting here in the ordinary world. Oh my god, that's an awful circle. In the ordinary world, here at the start of the story, and working your way back around to the start. And we will cover that when we go over each of these beats and how that's actually supposed to work, what the goal of that sort of structure is. So let's start with number 1, the ordinary world here. Just like most other story structures, when you start your story, you want to establish the ordinary world, or what is normal for your character. Like I said in the 3-act structure video, you don't want this to be boring. You want it to be interesting, but you want to basically set the stage, establish your characters and the setting. But you can also give hints as to what is to come, something might change. Next, we have the call to adventure. Now, this is where, for example, in a fantasy story, the farm boy finds out he's not really a farm boy and he must go on some great adventure. It's where your character is supposed to be pushed into a new world. So this is what would be the inciting incident, or the hook, the key, the event or object, something that is supposed to push your character over that threshold and off into the new world, into the story of this, novel or whatever it is you're writing. However, in the hero's journey, the next step is very specific. Usually, if it was just a general 3-act structure, your character will sort of be hesitant or not really want to answer to this call, for example, or they might not even actually understand it yet. However, in the hero's journey, it is specifically referred to as refuse the call. Most of the time, this is literally the character saying no. Now, that's pretty on the nose. It's very common for fantasy stories. You have your farm boy who's actually some child of prophecy, but he says, no, I just want to be a normal farm boy. It is a literal refusal to do what the plot wants him to do. And so that's very commonly how people do this, but obviously you don't have to be so literal. But generally speaking, there'll be more actual physical refusal from the character to take that step over the threshold that was presented here in the call to adventure. However, next, this is where in the 3-act structure we would have probably the first turning point or the first plot point, which is usually the first sort of twist of the story. In the hero's journey, it is specifically meet the mentor. Now, it could literally be a mentor figure. So, for example, in Lord of the Rings, you have Gandalf. In The Dark is Rising sequence by Susan Cooper, which is a really good fantasy series, you have Merriman, who is this old man who's basically like Merlin. In the King Arthur Legends, you do have Merlin, depending on which sort of version of the story you like. And so in this beat, the character comes into contact with this character or something that is going to help them throughout the rest of the journey. This is where basically they are solidified in that they have no choice. Usually in these sort of hero's journey stories, it is another character. Usually this mentor character or this event, something will happen that will provide the protagonist with tools or knowledge or something that is going to come back later on in the story to help them. Something that will stay with them throughout this journey and benefit them. And that is the end of Act 1. So then we move into Act 2, where we have cross the first threshold. Now the naming of this beat, it makes this sound like the first plot point, but it's not quite the same. It's more like the character's reaction to the previous Meet the Mentor beat. So in the Meet the Mentor beat, the character is basically showing that they have no choice but to answer the call that they refused earlier on. And then this first beat in Act 2 is basically their reaction to that, their preparation and that first step that they take. So this is where they will basically cross that threshold, literally walk through that doorway, leave the old world behind, and start on their journey in earnest. Next, we have tests, allies, and enemies. So this is the bulk of the story. It's where your character has to go and do whatever it is that the story wants them to do. They're going to move towards that end goal or the question or whatever it is that was set up in the call to adventure and whatnot. And they are going to come up, like in the normal 3-act structure, they're going to come up against a lot of trials, tribulations, conflicts. They're going to keep moving forward, but again, they are going to be pushed back a bit too. But in general, they are going to be moving forward towards the end goal. Next, we have Innermost Cave. This is an interesting one because it is specifically a beat that's designed to have the character become ready or specifically moving towards one particular big confrontation or conflict within the story. Not necessarily the very final one, because like in the 3-act structure, there's usually more than one sort of twist point or pinch point. But in this plot point, this is where the character is going to come up against something much bigger, much more daunting than in this part 6, Test, Allies, and Enemies. It's the way, in a story, a character comes up against a lot of obstacles, but then there's that point where this obstacle is going to be one that's really going to test them. Usually, this conflict as well, this innermost cave moment, will be external, yes, but it should also reflect the character's inner struggle. Because even though this story structure, with the way it's set up, is very much sort of an external conflict-based structure, you will always need to have an inner journey for the character in one way or another, but we'll discuss that a little bit more towards the end. So next, you have the ordeal. This is where the absolute biggest conflict of the story should happen. Just like in the 3-act structure, we have that first sort of big dark point for the character in the story where the character thinks they've hit rock bottom, but they haven't actually, and then we have the real darkest moment. Just like that, here we also have the real darkest moment in the ordeal. This is where the character really doesn't think they're going to win. This is where they have the biggest obstacle in front of them. A lot of the time it is literally life or death, because the hero's journey works so well with big dramatic stories. Usually this also means that they have to overcome the biggest inner conflict as well, something that they've been pushing back the entire time throughout this story. They finally have no choice but to face it as well. So this is, like in the 3-act structure, that sort of second point of no return. They have to face this final enemy, whether physical or not, and also themselves. Next, we have the last part, the last beat of Act 2, the reward. Now, a lot of the time, this would actually sound more like after the climax, they've defeated the enemy, and then the reward, they basically get the answer, they've reached their goal. A lot of the time it is a physical object in fantasy stories that they've actually finally gotten a hold of. But this is only the end of Act 2, so this is where they've overcome that last massive ordeal and they think, well, all's well and good, now we just have to go home. Which brings us into Act 3, the road back. So this is, as the name suggests, the character now has to try and find their way back to the ordinary world. Remember, up here, around here, they entered into the unknown, the new world. So all this time they're traveling through this new world, and even though they've reached their goal over here at the end of Act 2, they still haven't made it back to the ordinary world yet, up over here. So that means Act 3 is sort of the return journey, and the road back is the start of that. Usually they will face more obstacles. They won't quite be the same as over here in the ordeal, which was very much a story-centric, often a very external conflict, the big main conflict of the story. But they will face more obstacles. The biggest of which will be in the next beat, the resurrection. So obviously they're not home yet. They haven't made it back to their final goal, which is home usually. And they're coming up against more conflicts or more obstacles. And they hit this, the resurrection. This is where they have one final test. Usually this will be much less external and much more internal for the character. Over here in the ordeal, they were able to defeat that major external conflict, and they may have overcome a lot of their internal conflict too, but then we find over here in the resurrection, hang on a minute, there's still some internal problems going on, you know? So over here is where they will finally face their very personal challenge, that last roadblock to them finally getting what they really want, which is, you know, most likely to just return home. You know, this could be that the enemy comes back again, but either way, this should be the final conflict, which once the character defeats or overcomes, they have transformed. The character should have significantly changed, specifically at this point in the story. Obviously, they need to have character development and growth and change throughout the entire story, but the biggest point of internal change and understanding will usually come around here at the resurrection, pretty close to the end of the story actually. And once that has happened, we hit the final beat, which is return with the elixir. All of these beat names are very sort of fantasy centric, but you know, don't worry about that too much. Return with the elixir. This is where the protagonist has finally reached home. They've finally returned all the way back around to the start. We've completed the circle and they've made it back to the ordinary world. However, they are forever changed. This can be for the good, it could be for the worse, you know, but they need to have changed in some way. Usually the world will have changed as well. So in the 3-act structure, we spoke about how you have to juxtapose, or it's good to juxtapose the new world for the character with the old world, but usually that just has to do with the character's view or the way the character sees things or feels about things. But in the hero's journey, it can very literally be that the world has changed. The character has physically changed. They have physically become stronger, or maybe they've become traumatized and weak, who knows. But the whole world, the character's world, and usually the world itself will have changed. But that is where the story should generally conclude, with that very literal change in the character and the world, bringing it full circle in a much more concrete way than just the general 3-act structure does. Okay, so that's it for the general beats of the hero's journey, but let's have a quick talk about which beats, personally, this is very much a personal opinion thing, but I believe are the most important to think about if you want to write with the hero's journey. So firstly, obviously, the ordinary world. You can't start any story without having a good setup. Next, what I think you should concentrate on specifically for this structure is sort of around here. So the hero's journey, as I said, has a very specific, concrete refusal to the call, or sort of refusing to interact with the inciting incident. But then it's the meet the mentor over here that throws the character into the new world. This is very specific to the hero's journey. It's a very sort of set turning point in the story method for getting the character onto their journey. So I think it's good to keep these sort of beats, this area, the end of the Act 1 part of the story. I would say that sort of between the end of Act 2 over here, all the way up to returning to the ordinary world. In my opinion, this sort of middle part of the hero's journey, even though there are specific sort of tropes and they have very specific names to this structure, they're not that different to any other story structure. The most important parts are going to be the setup and then the conclusion, because the conclusion to the hero's journey is so specific in bringing it back around to the ordinary world. Something else you'll probably want to keep in mind is the mentor character or the object or whatever that might be. So this mentor is generally going to be there the entire story. They are going to be there to help the character, but they may also be a bit of a hindrance sometimes. But that character is going to be there as a sort of guiding light for your character when they get lost. And so they are going to appear in all these different places over here when your character runs into conflict and it looks like they're not going to get out. Your mentor character is likely going to be the one to help them. Over here in the final ordeal, the mentor is generally going to be the one to push that character, the main character, to be able to overcome these conflicts. But they will often disappear over here around the resurrection point. Because once your character has completed their goal, the mentor is no longer needed. So quite often in these stories, the mentor will sort of not necessarily disappear, but they have done their job, And so the character, when they return to the new world, or the return to the ordinary world in its new form, will often be alone. So yeah, that's it for the general beats for the hero's journey. As you can see, its basis is pretty much just the 3-act structure, but very specifically designed for a certain type of story. So, now that we've gone over the actual makeup of the hero's journey, next let's have a quick talk about what sort of stories are suited for this structure. So, obviously, one of the first ones that probably everyone would think of when they hear the hero's journey or they look at some of those diagrams is going to be fantasy stories. So because fantasy stories are basically adventure novels with fantastic elements, they are very suited to the idea of an actual journey, Lord of the Rings, all of those sort of books. But any story that has the character have to go through physical trials, anything where they have to go through a physical journey is going to benefit from this hero's journey structure. But it doesn't have to be fantasy, okay? So it can be fantasy or science fiction or anything like that, but it can be an adventure novel. You could use it for an apocalypse story. As long as you have your character starting in this ordinary world, they get these nudge to go out and do something that they have to do, or into this new world, but they literally refuse to, they don't want to, much more strongly than in just a general 3-act structure or other structure. But then they have no choice, they get forced into it and come all the way back around to the ordinary world transformed, then you can use this structure. I mean, if you wanted, you could also just take out the mentor. Like, I'm sure there are a lot of people who don't really like the idea of having a physical mentor character in their story, like a little angel on the shoulder or whatever, there to help the character out. But it doesn't have to be a physical character. It can just be, plot points that move the story along over and over again. It could be a motif, You know, it could be a recurring metaphor that moves the character along. So while on the surface this structure works best with stories that have a very clear external conflict, it also needs a character that is going to go through an inner journey that is just as important as the external one. Like, you can write stories, obviously, where the character doesn't transform much, like procedural crime thrillers or maybe a fantasy story where the character is just slaying monsters over and over again on contract or something, like those sort of serial stories. But those have a very different sort of structure. They're made a very different way to a normal novel. So as far as a normal novel structure goes, you really do need a character with some sort of internal conflict as well as the external conflict. Okay, so that's it for the hero's journey. I hope it helped. It personally took me a long time to actually properly sort of understand the hero's journey, and I don't know why. I've just always struggled with this particular structure, so I'm really sorry if I just really fudged it and made it harder to understand, but there are lots of good other videos on YouTube. So if mine hasn't helped, maybe check out some others, because the hero's journey is a very strong structure. It's something that if you enjoy planning and plotting, it's very easy to use. So that's it for this video. In the next video on this series, we are going to cover a structure that I personally love, but is very often misunderstood and misused, especially in the Western world, and that is Kisho Tenketsu, which is a very specific story structure to Asian literature and whatnot. But anyway, we'll discuss that in the next video. Look forward to that. Like and subscribe if you want to see more. I post every week. Turn on the notifications so you know when the next video goes up. But until then, keep those fingers on the keyboard and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.